When I first started writing this script, I didn't even know what to call this video, but this game is just something special and I need to talk about it. Unlike most, I've only been waiting for Silksong for 3 years, so that's how long it's been since I originally played Hollow Knight. However, despite that, I think I experienced the same euphoric reaction everyone else did when that September 4th popped up on my monitor. Now, do I think the game is perfect? No, but nothing is. And just because something isn't perfect doesn't mean it can't be a masterpiece. You can always find some things to complain about if you look hard enough, and believe me, there are a decent amount of complaints about Silksong, some justified, whereas others I disagree with. But regardless of your opinions on the various complaints about the game, there can always be beauty in imperfections, and beautiful, I think, is the best word I can use to encapsulate my feelings on this masterpiece. There's a part of me that would love to spend an hour ranting about how gorgeous the world of Farloom looks, or how breathtaking Christopher Larkin's soundtrack is, but I don't have the musical or artistic understanding to break any of that down in an interesting and educational way, and I bet a ton of people on the internet who are actually talented have done that already. However, I am a gamer, obviously, but I believe I have somewhat of a unique perspective. See, I am nowhere near a Hollow Knight speedrunning, no-hit run sweat lord, but at the same time, I wouldn't call myself a casual gamer either, although I do go to bed every night wishing I sweated out a different game. Anyway, as a result of this, I believe I can give a somewhat unique take on some of the main questions that have plagued Silksong since its release. Well, yeah, I can't talk. Starting with, is the game too hard? Before getting into it, I just thought I'd be clear. This video will mainly focus on what I believe are the community's main pain points regarding Silksong, purely because it's those aspects of the game I feel like I can give an interesting take on that isn't just, the game looks beautiful, the game is great, etc. Because that stuff's obvious. Right, with that stuff out of the way... See, to no one's surprise, Silksong blows most games out of the water when it comes to both launch day and highest ever concurrent player counts with a 587,000 peak. I mean, if nuking Steam, PlayStation, Xbox and Nintendo weren't an indicator, I don't know what is, and undoubtedly there were a lot of non-Hollow Knight mega fans jumping on the trend. Hell, I'm willing to bet a lot of people who didn't even play the first game were buying this game just because of the hype alone. But you see, a game made for everyone is a game made for no one, and I think the devs knew this, and as a result, they didn't pull any punches when it comes to the balance of this game. Sure, they nerfed some bosses like Sister Splinter and Morrowind post-launch, but ultimately the difficulty of the game remained mostly intact. This caused a lot of backlash online about the game being too hard, and undoubtedly the main pet peeve of all of this was the perceived abundance of double damage compared to the first game, which back then was only reserved for special occasions like our favourite actor, brother and dream goddess. However, I don't think the game is too hard overall. You see, something I've learned from games such as Destiny, Overwatch, Dead by Daylight and even the first Hollow Knight, something that I don't think a lot of people realise when it comes to combat in video games. There's a difference between something that is difficult and something that is punishing. Let's take two Silksong bosses for example, Grandmother Silk and Scar Sinner Carmelita. Which one of the following attacks is more threatening? Now, to someone who's not that experienced with gaming, they may say the Grandmother Silk attack for the reason that it deals an extra mask of damage, totaling at 3 instead of the standard 2. However, those who play the game know that Carmelita's attack, and honestly Carmelita as a whole, is far more threatening. As while her attacks deal less damage, they're significantly harder to dodge due to their speed and a harder to read telegraph, aka the unique animation a boss does before they do a certain attack. As you probably guessed, the point of this comparison was to show the aforementioned difference between something that is punishing and something that is dangerous. Something being more dangerous in the context of the Hollow Knight franchise means there's a higher chance of getting hit by an attack, and as a result taking damage, whereas something being more punishing means there's a higher consequence if you do get hit, such as taking more damage. Think of them as two separate factors that Team Cherry can adjust in order to ramp up difficulty, and the most important thing about this is that these two factors are linked when it comes to how difficult a boss is. A boss that deals a lot of damage but is easy to dodge is not that threatening, but a boss that is hard to dodge but only deals one mask of damage is also not that threatening outside of certain circumstances. Both of these factors need to be correctly balanced in order to create a balanced game, as a game like Silksong with no difficulty takes the tension and euphoric feeling of beating a boss out of the game. This all leads to what I believe is the biggest fundamental difference between Silksong and its predecessor, and the reason why there's so much double damage in this game: the Silk meter. Let's compare Soul to Silk in terms of healing. In the first game, it takes a total of 9 Soul as opposed to 8 Silk to heal 3 masks, so you can heal more often in Silksong. On top of this, Hornet combined a lot quicker than the Knight could, and Hornet can do this in mid-air. Bottom line, it is just easier to heal as Hornet than it ever was as the Knight. And sure, if Hornet gets interrupted, she loses 8 Silk as opposed to the Knight only losing 3 Soul, but due to the increased speed and airborne ability to heal, it is significantly harder to interrupt Hornet. As a result, healing in Silksong is undoubtedly less punishing, and Team Cherry needed to find a way to balance the scales of punishing the player in other areas of the game in order to make up for this. This is, in my opinion, the main reason for the increased prevalence of double damage in Silksong, which I think is undoubtedly the root cause for the perceived increase in difficulty of Silksong compared to OG Hollow Knight. And while those pre-nerfed worms did make me want to smash everything in sight my first playthrough, I think these changes were needed to make Silksong different. Obviously the two games differ in other ways, such as the area and music, but that was a given, as well as bosses being harder to dodge, which was undoubtedly done to counteract Hornet's significantly better agility and movement compared to the Knight. She can get out of the way faster, so the attacks needed to be harder to dodge, otherwise bosses would not be dangerous enough. Now look, I can understand the frustrations of players feeling constantly on their toes about basic enemies now, especially because Hornet starts with the same amount of masks as the Knight did. But I do genuinely believe this was a necessary evil in order to keep the game at a reasonable difficulty for the true Hollow Knight fans. You know, the ones who waited 7 years. Obviously, if Silksong was the same difficulty as the original Hollow Knight, it would be too easy for them, and I believe that Team Cherry was willing to lose some casuals or newcomers to the franchise to deliver an experience that would satisfy the 7-year wait Hollow Knight fans went through. But despite all that, the game, I genuinely believe, would have been too easy, with some bosses doing only 1 mask of damage. And have people ever felt much accomplishment from killing a boss that was very easy? Okay, I think I got my punishment and dangerous point across. Just one sidebar that I think also adds to the difficulty of Silksong is that the game has no Shade Cloak or anything really close to it apart from the Parry Silk skill, but that requires Silk, obviously, and you lose out on other very strong Silk skills. I'm sorry, but Shade Cloak was way too strong, and I think the lack of it is causing a bigger whiplash than people think. Okay, well that rant's over. What's next? Ah, gauntlets. I have such fond memories of them.
Yes! 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 Yes!
A few moments later.
Okay, so this game undoubtedly has significantly more gauntlets than the first game, and honestly, I think gauntlets on their own are actually fine. Yes, I died a lot to 2 of them in particular, but they're supposed to be a skill and power check to see if you have both the mechanical skill and enough upgrades to progress to the next part of the game, and if you have an abundance of one, you require less of the other in order to progress. Anyone who fought one of the Act 2 bosses in Act 3 after getting all the needle upgrades knows this, and honestly with the amount of variety in the enemy pool this game possesses, none of the gauntlets really bored me. I heard most people didn't really enjoy the amount of airborne enemies, but none of them were as bad as this monster, especially after claiming the claw line in Act 2. And side note, I think a lot of the flying enemies in this game look really cool. Also, out of two very big outliers, most of the gauntlets in the game aren't even that long, with them only possessing a few rounds. However, I specifically said I don't mind gauntlets on their own. But what happens when they're not on their own? I think gauntlets in this game start to become a little oppressive when they are paired with other factors. The first of these factors being when there's a boss at the end of the gauntlet, as the whole foundation of Silksong when it comes to boss combat is learning the boss's telegraphs, and when you have mastered them enough, you learn how and when to damage the boss without taking damage, and eventually you kill it. I know, very complex. But when you have to face a gauntlet every time you attempt the boss, it takes longer to kill that boss as it's harder to learn the telegraphs, especially if you struggle with the gauntlet because you might not even have a chance to try the boss every time if you die to the gauntlet first. There is undoubtedly one boss in this game that represents this flaw with some of this game's gauntlets better than any other, and it's everyone's favourite snail shaman eating thing, Gruul the Great. Now, hot take, on his own, I think Gruul is actually a good boss. He has a cool design, his attacks aren't that hard to dodge in my opinion, I love the spike ball thing, it's simple but fun, I love the unique interactions he has when you throw something in his mouth, and him using Vengeful Spirit actually gave me a oh shit moment the first time I fought him, something most bosses honestly didn't do in this game despite how good they are. However, despite all of this, the reason many people, myself included, didn't really like Gruul is because everything else about him is ass. Incredibly long run back, the worst in the game unless you find the secret bench, which I and many others did not. A brutal gauntlet beforehand, which you have to traverse every time you fight him, which wouldn't even be that bad if it wasn't for these dudes. The worst enemy in the game, hands down. Remember what I said earlier about enemies having to be more punishing to compensate for Hornet's much better heal? Well, unless you play perfectly, you don't get to heal in Biowater, so unless you went to Putrefied Ducks before fighting Gruul, you have no way to counter the stinky water. Yay! Essentially, gauntlets when paired with bosses and or a long run back do cause gauntlets to feel pretty oppressive in my opinion due to the aforementioned factors, which turn gauntlets from a fun combat encounter into a stepping stone required in order to learn what is otherwise a cool boss. Another problem I have with gauntlets when they are paired up with bosses is that it can often cause the opposite effect of Gruul in that it can make bosses easier. That probably doesn't make sense given I just spent the first half of this part of the video waffling about how the gauntlets before Gruul made him harder, but not every boss in the game is the same and different bosses have different problems, and this is perfectly encapsulated in Crust King Khan. Now don't get me wrong, the area, OST, design and attack aesthetic of Khan are all fantastic, and this honestly makes him one of my favourite bosses, but it is undeniable that Khan is one of the easiest bosses in the game with cool but very easy telegraphs to read, and even if you don't think he was an easy boss, he was undoubtedly undertuned when you factor in the fact that this is an Act 3 boss. Now I believe the reason for this is because you have to deal with 4 separate gauntlets before fighting Khan, and sure, if you die in the Coral Tower, you don't have to get your cocoon, but you do have to do the first 3 gauntlets over again until you beat the 3rd one, after which a shortcut appears. Now, by all means, Khan isn't a bad boss for the aforementioned reasons, but in my opinion Khan, and by extension the entire Coral Tower, could have been so much more, and I think Team Cherry went easy on Khan to compensate for the 37, I think, waves you have to deal with before getting to him. Now I'm not Team Cherry, but personally there is one design choice that I think was a mistake when it came to Silksong. I think the game would have been better if gauntlets were made so that if there was a boss after the gauntlet, I would have made the gauntlet even harder, but upon reaching the boss, you don't have to redo the gauntlet if you die. This way, it deals with a lot of the frustration that bosses like Gruul cause, as you would be able to attempt Gruul again and again should you die after reaching him, and because there's no gauntlet in between, Team Cherry could have made bosses like Khan a little harder without this feeling too oppressive for the player. It solves two issues I personally had with the game despite them being completely different, and it would allow Team Cherry to keep what I believe was their vision of the game intact, that being it should be a hard game, while also taking away one of the main frustrations I think a lot of players had. To be clear however, I wouldn't apply this to places like the High Halls Gauntlet, as while it has a difficult mini-boss-esque enemy at the middle and end, it doesn't actually have a boss, so applying my proposed changes would take away from that experience, whereas I don't think this would be the case with bosses like Gruul and Khan. You could even buff Gruul's health if you implemented this change, and I did feel like his health was a little bit low to compensate for the gauntlet and runback, making the boss itself, excluding other factors, a bit more satisfying. Speaking of runbacks, let's talk about them. So, this game undoubtedly has a lot of runbacks, as did the first Hollow Knight. However, they feel a bit I don't really know what words to use to describe them, but they definitely feel more punishing than the first game. Now, everyone likes to talk about the Biowater runback, and don't get me wrong, that was the only part of this game where I was genuinely miserable, but I think that's a pretty egregious outlier, and I've spoken about the frog enough. Wait, is Gruul a frog? Anyway, despite runbacks being a pretty big complaint about this game as well, and despite them definitely being responsible for me raging a bit, especially at the Savage Beast Flight, oh my god, that part sucked, I honestly don't have much to say about them. They are clearly longer to compensate for Hornet's faster movement, as if the runbacks were as long as they were in the first Hollow Knight, you reach your boss again in like 5 seconds, and while I'm sure some people would love, there has to be some form of punishment for dying, as it should warrant a punishment, obviously, and I think the risk of dying with an active cocoon while heading back is a decent punishment. Now granted, some people might hate that, but I think that speaks to Silksong's really cruel economy, more so than it does to the runbacks, and if you're someone like me who refused to convert my currency into beads throughout my whole run of the game, then it's your own fault if you die twice in a row. To be honest, when I decided I was going to dedicate a section of this video to runbacks, I thought I'd have more to say on them, but I don't, to be honest, so yeah. Runbacks are a part of Metroidvanias in the same way as dealing with toxic teammates on mic is a part of online shooters, it's just how it is. I suppose if this game had a Dreamgate-esque ability it would have made things easier, but maybe another hot take, as someone who only played the first Hollow Knight, after Dreamgates were added, I felt like it made the game too easy. Like it took like about 50% of the traversal part out of the game after getting it, so I'm glad there wasn't a Farlem equivalent to the Dreamgate. I don't know, maybe we'll get one in the DLC. Right. What's next? To end the video, I just wanted to waffle about some random things I noticed while playing Silksong that were worth talking about in my opinion, but weren't long enough to dedicate a full section to like the previous two topics. To start, I really like how they changed staggers in this game. In the original Hollow Knight, a boss would be staggered for a few seconds unless they were hit, in which case the stagger would immediately end. In Silksong, bosses don't end their stagger if you hit them, and instead the stagger just lasts a certain amount of time. This is significant because in the original game, in my opinion, unless you were full health, it was always worth healing, as 3 Mars healed was far better than 1 hit on the boss. Whereas in Silksong it's 3 masks versus multiple hits on the boss, making the high risk high reward nature of staggers much more interesting. Side note, I know most very good players would just spam D-Dark or Abyss Shriek during a stagger, as that was the meta, but most people don't know that on a first playthrough. I mentioned this briefly before, but there's significantly less iframes in this game due to no Shade Cloak or D-Dark or anything like that, but I like this as it makes your movement more important, and given Hornet's mass amount of movement options I think this is fine. The Crest system I think is incredible, granting far more versatility and actually creating unique playstyles that weren't nearly as present in Hollow Knight, but also having just a decent amount of depth when compared to games in general. The unique animations, charged attack, pogo, unbind all help to sell the immersion of each Crest identity, and I love that. Especially Hunter's Crest. Like the pogo, oh my god, the pogo is so satisfying, like it's the best one, like it has to be. I said earlier I wouldn't go into much detail, and I still won't, but god, the soundtrack, art direction and overall aesthetic of this game is honestly the best I've seen in a video game, especially when it comes to soundtracks. The Clockwork Core, Enter Farloom, Khan and Sister of the Void, and the threefold melody genuinely made me a little emotional when I first heard it. The boss design as a whole I would give a 9 out of 10, and thank god there's no boss like Nosk in this game. Like, he was good thematically, but when he would just run into you with no telegraph, yeah, that wasn't fun. All in all, despite most of this video being about the negatives I had with the game, when you boil it down, they were all pretty much nitpicks. As I said at the start, this game is definitely not perfect, after all nothing is, but that doesn't mean it can't be a masterpiece, and my 64 hours in Silksong were without a doubt one of the best solo gaming experiences I ever had. Well done, Team Cherry. I hope this isn't the end of the Hollow Knight franchise. I personally would love a lace game, but if it is the end, know that you ended it on a high, and the 7-year wait was well worth it. I had a blast. For like 62 hours of that time, alright? I know I defended Gruul as a boss, but overall I had a miserable time during my 2 hours in Bellwater. Screw that place and the devil who made it. Bye bye.